So we just got the patch notes for the upcoming 1.4.3 build. This will be launching on June 17th, this upcoming Monday, if you're watching this video on the day that it comes out. And while probably the biggest news is the change to how Holy Bolt's Elixir work, that's not what we're here to talk about. We need to talk about the fact that the developers saw fit to just increase every single one of the sacrifice bonuses in the Book of the Dead for the Necromancer, and it's kind of difficult to understand how much these various changes all really add up to on these builds. So I did what I always do. I made a data sheet where I crunched every single number comparing the old and the new. On top of that, comparing the old and new when considering Memento Mori, which gives you a 60% bonus to all of this. And on top of that as well, they also increased the sacrificial aspect. Sacrificial says that your sacrifice bonuses are increased by another 25% multiplier. And upcoming in this patch, it's actually going to be a 50% multiplier. So that means that you have your base, various damage bonuses. You get a 60% bonus from Memento Mori and then a 50% bonus, all of these multiplied together. So we also included the difference if you include Sacrificial to understand just how valuable is this aspect now on your build if you wanted to slot it in. So let's go ahead and go through the math just so that people have a better understanding of what to grok here and what to really hold on to, and then carry that through to talk about the relative changes and at what points your build have gained damage increase. Because basically every single non-minion build and even Shadow Mages have gained increased damage from the changes to the Book of the Dead. So when we're talking about the sacrifice bonuses for the Book of the Dead, we're talking very specifically about sacrificing our skeleton warriors, sacrificing our skeleton mages, and sacrificing potentially our golem. The other thing to understand is that we also had Memento Mori, which if you put 3 skill points into this and you sacrifice your skeleton warriors and your skeleton mages, their bonuses were increased by 60%. Keep in mind, Memento Mori does not look at and does not care about your golem, and you don't need to sacrifice your golem to get this bonus. As such, Memento Mori does not impact the golem part of these calculations at all. But when we look at what the original amounts for all of these things were in order, going from warriors to mages to golem, you could get 5% crit chance from sacrificing skirmishers. You could get 20% resistance from sacrificing your defenders. You could get a 15% shadow damage boost from sacrificing your reapers. You could gain 15 essence from sacrificing your shadow mages. You can gain a 15% vulnerable damage multiplier from sacrificing your cold mages. And you can gain a 25% multiplier from sacrificing your bone mages for overpower damage. And then, like I said, 10% attack speed from your golem, 10% maximum life from your blood golem, and then 30% multiplier when you crit from your iron golem. Now, they just increased all of these numbers. So crit chance is now 10% crit chance. It's actually just like pretty good right off the bat. You get 25 res. It's a 20% damage multiplier from shadow. You get 20 essence. Oh, and on top of that, they actually added the fact that now that when you sacrifice your shadow mages, you also gain an essence generation percentage, which is really nice. Basically, you use the maximum essence option in the early game when your gear is weak enough where this outperforms the vulnerable damage multiplier. And this also just makes essence generation easier to manage before your gear is fully online. So I actually really, really like that change. And it's also just generally good for leveling in the early game too. But they increased all of these numbers. Basically, damage multipliers all got an additional 5%. That's not the same thing as them all increasing by 5%. They all got 5%. So from 15 to 20 and from 25 to 30. And then from 30 to 35. So when we talk about the damage increase just from these changes, ignoring basically every other thing, like don't worry about Memento Mori, don't worry about Sacrificial, just the damage increase you get right now for having these buttons clicked, you get 4.3% more shadow damage, 4.3% more vulnerable damage, 4% more overpower damage, and 3.8% more critical strike damage. And just for the context of how do you even get to this number, like how do you determine what the relative increase in damage is, what you do is you compare the new multiplier, which is a 1.2 times multiplier, against the old multiplier, which is a 1.15. So the difference in doing 1.2 times your damage as opposed to 1.15 times your damage is 4.3478, blah, 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 blah. So that's how we get to these numbers. It's really important to not just look at what the relative increase in the multiplier itself is, but actually how much it increases your damage by. Because it turns out going from 15% to 20% is a 33% increase in that multiplier, which is true. That is accurate. You have increased that number by 33%. That is not the same thing as saying that we have increased our damage by 33%, because the multiplier itself is 100 plus this bonus and not just this bonus in a vacuum. Here is where we can already calculate just how much stronger a certain build has become, which is the Bone Spirit build. Bone Spirit sacrifices its mages for an overpower multiplier, and it sacrifices its golem for crit damage multiplier, but it continues to use defender minions because we need them to generate essence through Requiem, etc., etc. So the Bone Spirit build, just based off these sacrifice changes, now does 8% more damage, and basically, we also have to do a little bit of a calculation, which will probably be its own video, which talks about what essence opportunities there are here, considering that we can get more essence out of sacrificing our minions, and whether or not that means that we should use the overpower multiplier or the essence multiplier. I've done some napkin math, and it's absolutely that the overpower multiplier is just strictly stronger. But again, I'm going to do a whole video about that because I know people are going to have a lot of questions. But yes, I've thought about it. Yes, I have a little note here. I'll also include this page here so that people can go take a look at these numbers if they want to themselves. And then the only other thing to note is that you're going to see like these little asterisks next to an X where increasing crit chance. Does this increase your damage? Technically speaking, it might if your build needed more crit chance, or if your build can now afford to drop a crit chance stat on your gear. Technically speaking, this crit chance could increase your damage. How would I personally calculate that for you? Physically impossible to do that. And that's going to require just like a lot more testing later on to figure out like what that means for these builds and what it does allow you to change. Most notably from the things with asterisks, the attack speed and the maximum life sacrifices for the golem are actually very significant, because oddly enough, there are builds, most notably Shadow Dot builds, that don't care about sacrificing for the crit damage, but would love to get more maximum life as well as more attack speed from these sacrifices. So that is important, that is valuable, that will increase survivability or damage output. But again, just something that's very, like nearly impossible for me to calculate without looking at a specific build and its specific stats. Okay. That's it with the caveats. Now let's talk about the impact from Memento Mori and how much more valuable these stats are for sacrificing your minions. So here in column F, these are the values that you used to get from having Memento Mori. So instead of getting 5% crit chance, you would get 8% crit chance because it's a 60% bonus on top of the 5% that we had previously. Now, with the increase to the base stat, you're getting 16% crit chance from sacrificing your skirmishers and having Memento Mori. That's how we're going to get to the numbers in here, column G, and how much their relative damage numbers are going to increase from here. So again, like you get 16% crit chance. You could have 40% resistance from defenders. Not that you need resistance at all, but it's cool that the number gets that big. We're now getting a 32% multiplier for shadow damage. We're getting 32 essence. Again, 32 vulnerable damage multiplier, a 48% overpower multiplier. And then again, remember that your golem is unaffected by Memento Mori. The reason why we have old Memento Mori over here is because technically speaking, this is based off of the old stats that we had, and they did buff the golem. So new Memento Mori is actually just representative of the fact that these numbers are now new. I also have notes here, which is Memento Mori doesn't affect golem, but golem in general got buffed. Now, how much of an increase is this change in Memento Mori? So assuming that you're sacrificing both of your skeletons, how much more damage are you now doing because you have these 3 skill points in your skill tree? For shadow damage, it's a 6.45% damage increase. Same for vulnerable. For overpower, it's a 5.7% increase. And now here's where we can start to look at some builds, basically every single non-minion build, and technically speaking, also shadow mages. I realized I didn't include this one here, but technically speaking, shadow mages are now just that much more stronger because they do sacrifice their golem. But now we can start to look at how much stronger the different types of builds on the Necromancer have become if they are sacrificing their minions. So for shadow crit builds, this is Sever, this is Infinimist, this is going to be a new proc blight build I'm going to work on as soon as I get a Doombringer, since they buffed that as well. But your shadow crit builds, ones that do shadow damage, vulnerable damage, and critical strike damage, have become 17.6% stronger. That's like decent. If you saw my most recent video where I basically said all of the core skills can't actually scale because their damage numbers are too low, this is not nearly enough. They basically need like a 10 times multiplier to be on the same scale as things like Ebon Piercer and Bone Spirit and minions. But they have become 17.6% stronger. They are doing 17% increased damage for doing nothing else. They don't have to change anything else about their build. They're just that much stronger. Shadow Dot builds, so this is Blighted Corpse Explosion, as well as Shadow Bloodwave or Shadow Surfer, and Blight, most notably, are 13% stronger. Bone Spear is now 10.5% stronger. The blood builds in general are just under 10% stronger. And then again, Shadow Mages have gained 3% damage just from this change because they sacrifice their crit golem for more damage. But now let's talk about the sacrificial aspect, because the interesting part about sacrificial is that it's really hard to kind of calculate how valuable it is. It doesn't have a direct one-to-one correlation between increasing your sacrifices means that you do this much more damage. Like, you can't look at it as it is right now and go, oh, it's clearly a 50% damage multiplier. Well, no, it's not. It's increasing 3 different multipliers that you have and increasing their values by 50%. And you need to look at how much that is versus how much it was to figure out the actual increase in damage, and then put all those things together to figure out whether or not this aspect is good for you to use on your build. So right now, putting Sacrificial onto like a one-hander, like not putting it onto your amulet and not putting it onto your two-hander, people are going to ask a question like, oh, why wouldn't you do that? Wouldn't it make it better? Remember, doubling up something like Blighted gives you a 240% total damage multiplier. Doubling up Sacrificial is not going to get anywhere near those numbers, but they are pretty substantial. So if you were to sacrifice your skirmishers, have Memento Mori, and put on Sacrificial at a 50% bonus, you're now gaining 24% critical strike chance, which is 8% additional critical strike chance, which starts to beg the question of, if I'm sacrificing all my minions, do I need something like Grasping Veins for the crit chance, or can I actually just run Sacrificial? Yes, you lose out on the multiplier too, but we have to think about these numbers in more interesting ways just outside of pure damage to figure out how much utility they add to your build. Similarly, you can gain 60% resistance. Not that you need it, but you do. Your shadow damage multiplier becomes a 48% multiplier. You get 48 total essence. Your vulnerable damage is a 48% multiplier. Your overpower damage is a 72% multiplier. And because Sacrificial does work for your golems, you can either gain 22% attack speed, 22% maximum life, which is actually really significant. That is a huge amount of maximum life there. Yes, it's the difference between 22% and 15%, but that is a massive, massive increase. And then on top of that, your Golem crit multiplier becomes a 52% multiplier. But what does that mean for you in the actual expected damage increase from each one of these numbers? Shadow damage, this is a 12% increase in shadow damage. It's a 12% increase in vuln damage, 16% increase in your overpower damage, and a 12 or nearly 13% increase in crit damage. Okay, great. What does that mean for my build? How much value does putting Sacrificial on my build do right now for me? Well, it's going to similarly follow the increases that we just saw in build damage outright, because they're going to be using the same types of multipliers to figure out this math. So your Shadow Crit builds, again, Sever, Infinimist, a Proc Blight build if I can find myself a Doombringer, is gaining a 42% multiplier from putting this aspect on. That's actually really big. If you think about the fact that we currently use Damned, which is a 50% damage multiplier, the Shadow Crit builds could gain a 40% multiplier by putting this aspect onto their build right now. That's basically like putting on the Ring of Starless Skies from before, although that one has been buffed recently, but that is a sizable amount of a damage increase. For Shadow Dot builds, it's like gaining a 27% multiplier, so it's like gaining Conceited aspect, except you don't have to have Barrier up, and it outperforms Conceited just a little bit here. Bone Spear, similarly, it's like gaining a 25% damage multiplier. Blood builds actually get to enjoy a 31% damage multiplier from this aspect, whereas the Bone Spirit build would only enjoy a 12% damage multiplier here, so slightly outperforming Inner Calm if you haven't stood still for 3 seconds, but generally not better than any of the options. So while I don't believe that Sacrificial is all of a sudden going to make a huge splash across the majority of builds, there are definitely scenarios where you kind of had a free floating aspect slot and you were looking for whatever the best option is. And at the very least, if you are sacrificing the minions that are relevant for your build, you can enjoy better than conceded uptime and better than conceded performance by putting Sacrificial on, as opposed to not having run it previously. So always keep that in mind. These numbers are going to look vastly different if you're only sacrificing like 1 or 2 or one or the other, or only one type of skeleton as opposed to the other ones. So always just keep that in mind as well. In general, how do I feel about the Book of the Dead changes? I do appreciate the fact that they said, hey, the Book of the Dead sacrifices are now just like not up to snuff with the amount of value that you gain from running your minions. And it was always meant to be a legitimate secondary form of playing the Necromancer. You either did use minions or you didn't use minions, and they were supposed to be roughly equivalent in output or options for builds to benefit from them. I do like the fact that also, like early on, once you start sacrificing your minions, getting a huge amount of crit chance or attack speed or maximum life or just straight up damage multipliers is now significantly better than it was previously. And that these numbers are significant. They're not enough to bridge the gap with the issues in my previous video, but they are significant, and I do like that Sacrificial, most notably, is an aspect that you can quite legitimately consider running on your build, and you should enjoy the benefits of it if you have a floating slot where you just can't really figure out how to fit in another aspect. Now you always have a good option as long as you're sacrificing your minions. Thought that the Book of the Dead was kind of substantial enough where I could put all these things together in one easy place for people to look at so that people can kind of sit down with it, digest it. Let me know down in the comments if you have any questions, concerns, ideas, if you came up with like an alternative like conclusions based off of all this. I'd love to hear from you. If you're brand new here, go ahead and subscribe to the channel. If you're a minion sacrifice enjoyer like me, go ahead and toss a like onto the video as well. If you wouldn't mind doing that, I would deeply appreciate it. But as always, thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you when the patch goes live.